That land reads to the new survey, Mr. Calloway. And the new survey says it belongs to the community. So move your animals, or we will move them for you. That was Diane Pruitt, president of the Stone Ridge Ranch Homeowners Association for 11 years running, standing at my gate in white sneakers and a blazer, the color of a road flare, telling me that 40 acres my grandfather fenced in 1951 had been handed to her board with the stroke of a pen. The land she was pointing at was my east pasture. My cattle were on it. My wife was buried within sight of it, under the cottonwood at the top of the rise, and Diane was telling me to move them or she would. What she did not know, standing there with her clipboard and her freshly printed plat, was that the survey she was waving had no legal standing against the deed in my safe. That the deed in my safe was recorded in the county in 1949, and that I had spent 31 years as a licensed land surveyor before I retired to run cattle. She was handing a boundary argument to a man who measured boundaries for a living. So, tell me, if a woman in kitten heels told you the dirt your grandfather cleared was now a common area, and she had the county half convinced, what would you have done first? My name is Wade Calloway. I am 63 years old. I ran a survey practice out of a county 2 valleys over for most of my working life. 31 years of pulling chain and setting pins and standing in creek bottoms in waders, arguing with other men's fences. And I was good at it because I am patient and I do not guess. When my wife Ellen got sick, I sold the practice to a younger man who had clerked for me. And I moved us back to the home place, 420 acres of grass and cottonwood, and one slow creek that my family has held since before the county had paved roads. My great-grandfather walked this ground behind a team of horses. My grandfather strung the wire I am about to tell you about by hand, with a stretcher and a fence pliers, in the spring of 1951, and he set the corner pins off the survey of 1949, and those pins are still there, and I have put my own hand on every one of them. Ellen passed 4 years ago in the front bedroom, in the fall, with the window open, so she could hear the creek. My daughter Nora, who is 16 now, lives with me in the house my great-grandfather built. She was 12 when her mother died, and the two of us learned to run this place together out of grief and stubbornness in about equal measure. We run a small cow-calf operation, 30-some pairs, that pays for itself and the property taxes and not much more. And that was never the point. The point was the ground. The east pasture, the 40 acres Diane Pruitt wanted, is the best grass I have, 40 acres of bottomland that holds water late into the summer when everything else burns off. It is also where Ellen asked to be buried, under the cottonwood at the top of the rise, where you can see the whole valley, and I dug that grave myself with a backhoe and a flat shovel, and I kept that promise. So when a woman in a red blazer told me to move my cattle off that pasture, or she would, what she was really telling me, without knowing it, was to move my wife. I was not going to move my wife. The trouble started the year the developer came in. Stone Ridge Ranch was not a ranch. It was a gated subdivision of big houses on small lots that a company called Meridian Land Partners had carved out of the old Hutchins spread, north of my line, and the homeowners association that came with it had spent its first few years policing paint colors and mailbox heights and the wrong kind of holiday lights inside its own fences. I did not belong to it. My land had never belonged to it. There was no covenant on my deed, no membership, no shared road, nothing. My grandfather sold the Hutchins family a hay lease once in the 60s, and that was the deepest connection my family ever had to that ground. And yet, Diane Pruitt had married into Meridian. Her husband, Glenn, was a partner in the company, the kind of man who wore a quarter-zip pullover to a county meeting, and called the planning staff by their first names, and Meridian had run out of room to build inside the original plat. Every lot they had drawn, they had sold. The money machine that was Stone Ridge Ranch had stopped because it had nowhere left to grow. And the cheapest ground available to start it up again, the only ground that touched their back fence and did not require a new road or a new water line, was the 40 acres of mine that bordered their property on the south. I learned all of that later, in pieces, the way you learn anything worth knowing. At the start, I just thought she was wrong about a line, the way people are wrong about lines all the time. In 31 years, I corrected more honest boundary mistakes than I can count. Neighbors who had mowed 10 feet into each other's yards for a decade and never knew it. And almost every one of them was settled with a deed, a tape, and a cup of coffee. So I figured a careful man with a recorded deed could correct a mistake before it grew teeth. I have a folder for that. I have always had a folder for that. 31 years of surveying taught me that the man who keeps the paper wins the argument, and the man who raises his voice loses it. So I bought a box of manila folders and a yellow legal pad the week we moved in, and I labeled the first folder with the date and the words East Line, and every time Stone Ridge touched my property, I wrote it down in my own hand and I filed it. Date, time, who, what was said, what was done. The same after-action habit I kept on every job for 3 decades. It is the most boring thing in the world right up until the day it is the only thing that matters. The first touch came on a Tuesday in March. A letter certified, which meant I had to drive to the post office and sign for it, from the Stone Ridge Ranch Homeowners Association, informing me that a recent community resurvey had identified a discrepancy in the southern boundary and that approximately 40 acres currently used for livestock. Amended plat. The letter asked me to remove all animals and temporary structures within 30 days. It was signed by Diane Pruitt, President. I read it twice in the post office parking lot. Then I drove to the county recorder's office, the same counter I had stood at 1,000 times as a working surveyor, and I pulled my own deed and the original government survey and the chain of title back to the 1890s, and I laid all of it next to whatever Diane thought she had. And I confirmed in about 10 minutes what I already knew. The line she was claiming ran a 1/4 mile inside my deeded boundary. Her amended plat had no recorded basis. It was not signed by a licensed surveyor. It was not stamped. It was not recorded. It was a drawing. A nice drawing, on good heavy paper, with a north arrow, and a legend. But a drawing, and I have drawn enough of them to know the difference between a map and a deed. I wrote her back. 1 page, polite, factual, the kind of letter I had written to opposing parties for 30 years. I gave her my deed book and page, the date of the controlling survey, the names of the corner monuments, and an invitation to have her surveyor call mine, except mine was me. So I invited her surveyor to call me directly, and I gave her my number. I kept a copy, and I mailed the original certified, so there would be a green card with her signature on it, proving she got it. That was incident 1, and I wrote the number 1 in the corner of the folder and underlined it. She did not have her surveyor call. I do not think she had a surveyor. What she had instead was a second letter. 3 weeks later, this one adding a daily fine. $200 a day, accruing from the date of the first notice, for the continued trespass of my livestock on community land. I stood in the kitchen and read that one out loud to Nora, who was doing geometry homework at the table, and she looked up over her pencil and asked if they could really do that. I told her they could write it. Whether they could collect it was a different question, and the answer was no, but I did not say the second part loud, because she was 16 and I did not want her carrying a number in her head that grew every night while she slept. I just filed the letter and wrote the number 2, and I told her the truth that mattered, which was that we were fine, and that the people who keep the paper do not lose. The fines are where most people get scared, and I understood the strategy even as it was aimed at me, because I had watched it aimed at others across a career. A number that grows every day feels like a clock. It is designed to make you act fast and act emotional, to make you call and shout or write a check just to stop the bleeding. Yet a fine from an HOA you do not belong to, on land that is not theirs, levied under a covenant that does not bind you, is just a piece of paper that says a number. It has no more force than a child's IOU. I let it grow on purpose, because every notice they sent was another dated page in a folder that was getting heavier every month. Another piece of evidence that they kept escalating after being shown the deed. I photographed every notice the day it arrived. I saved each one to a folder on my computer and to a second drive I kept in the safe, because a surveyor learns early that the original always disappears the day you need it in court. By the end of that first spring, the paper fine on my East Pasture was over $11,000 and climbing, and not 1 cent of it was real. And I slept fine every night. Then Diane got creative, which is the part of these stories where the trouble stops being letters and starts having a face. On a Thursday morning in May, a man in a tan shirt with a clipboard and a laminated badge on a lanyard walked up my driveway and announced he was there for a compliance inspection of the common area. He had a measuring wheel and a high visibility vest, and the whole costume of authority. I came down off the porch with my coffee and asked to see the badge. It said Stone Ridge Ranch Code Enforcement, which is not a thing, because Stone Ridge Ranch is a homeowners association, and not a unit of government. And homeowners associations do not have code enforcement officers any more than my book club has a sheriff. I told him he was standing on private deeded property and asked him to leave. He told me he had authority to inspect the common area on behalf of the association. I told him he had a laminated card and a vest he could have bought at any farm store, and that the nearest common area was a quarter-mile north through a fence his employer did not own. He squared up like he expected me to back down. I did not raise my voice. I just told him the deputy I was about to call would explain it better than I could. He left, but he walked the fence line first and took pictures of my posts and my wire. And I stood my own driveway and took pictures of him taking pictures. And I got his face, his clipboard, the magnetic sign on his truck door, and the plate. I filed all of it. Incident 5, because 2 more letters had come in between, one about a stock tank and one about a gate. That afternoon, I called the county sheriff's office, not to file a complaint exactly, but to get the whole thing on the record. The deputy who came out was a steady young man named Marcus Lau, and he listened to the entire thing at my kitchen table, with his hat off and his notebook out, and a cup of coffee going cold in front of him because he was writing too much to drink it. I walked him through it from the first certified letter to the man with the laminated badge, and I laid the folder open and let him turn the pages. He told me something I already half knew, but needed to hear from a uniform. He said the association could keep sending people and keep writing letters, and that as long as nobody crossed into trespass or destruction of property. His hands were mostly tied, because a civil boundary dispute is not a crime and a deputy cannot arrest a man for being wrong about a line. Then he leaned forward and told me the part that mattered. He said the thing that would change all of that was a pattern. Documented, dated, specific, the kind of record that shows a person was told the truth and kept going anyway. He said if I kept building the file the way I was building it, There would come a day when they did something that crossed a line into the criminal, and on that day the file would matter more than anything I could say or shout, because it would prove they knew. Then he wrote down the fake inspector with the plate number I had photographed, and he gave me a case number. And I wrote the case number in the folder in ink, and Marcus Lau became the first person outside my own house who had seen the whole shape of it, and the first uniform with my deed in his understanding, if not yet in his hand. I want to stop here for a second, because this is the part people skip. It is not exciting to write a number in a folder. It does not feel like fighting back. The whole time the fine clock was running, and the fake badge was walking up my drive, the satisfying thing to do would have been to call Diane Pruitt and tell her exactly what I thought of her survey. I never did. Not once. Every time the anger came up, and it came up plenty, I put it into the folder instead of into the phone. That discipline is the only reason this story ends the way it does. Keep that in your mind as it climbs, because it climbs. The summer brought the lawsuit. Stone Ridge Ranch Homeowners Association versus Wade Calloway, filed in county civil court, seeking to quiet title to the disputed 40 acres in favor of the association and to recover accrued fines. I was served on a Saturday while I was fixing a water gap on the creek. The process server was apologetic. I thanked him, signed, and carried the papers up to the house, and that night, after Nora went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table and read every page. The complaint leaned entirely on the amended plat. There was no recorded deed cited in their favor because there was none to cite. They were betting that a retired rancher would either fold under legal fees or fail to answer in time and lose by default. They had picked the wrong rancher, but they had no way of knowing that yet, and I was in no hurry to teach them. I hired a lawyer, a plain-spoken woman named Ruth Hadley, who practiced out of a storefront office in the county seat between a tax prepper and a barber, and who had handled boundary cases for 30 years and did not scare. She read my deed and the original survey, and she got quiet. In the good way, the way a card player gets quiet when the hand is better than the bet. She told me their case was paper thin, and that the smartest thing we could do was nothing dramatic at all. Just answer cleanly and let them keep spending money building a case on sand. Filing fees, surveyor fees if they ever hired one, attorney hours, all stacked on a foundation that did not exist. I told her about the fines, the fake inspector, the letters, the stock tank notice, the gate notice, and I slid the folder across her desk, and she went through it page by page slow. And when she got to the end, she squared the stack and looked up and asked how long I had been keeping records like this. I told her 31 years, more or less, that it was just how I was built. She said it showed, and she said it like it was the best news she had gotten all month. It was Ruth who found the husband. She pulled the corporate filings for Meridian Land Partners, and there was Glenn Pruitt listed as a managing partner, and she pulled the county's pending development applications and found one filed the previous fall before the first letter ever reached my mailbox. Meridian had applied to extend Stone Ridge Ranch with a new phase, 41 new lots, and the proposed plat for that new phase ran right across my east pasture, right over the cottonwood, right over the bottom land that held water late, right over my wife's grave. The 40 acres Diane wanted as common area were never going to stay common. They were going to become 41 houses, and Glenn Pruitt's company was going to sell every one. The survey at my gate, the fine clock, the fake inspector, the lawsuit, all of it, was not an aesthetic dispute about a community boundary. It was a land grab dressed up as a covenant, and the woman in the red blazer was the front for a man who needed my grass to make his next several $1,000,000. Ruth laid the development application on the desk next to my deed, and the two documents told the whole story. without either of us saying a word. That changed how it felt. It did not change what I did. I still filed everything. Now, though, I understood the clock she was running, and I had a clock of my own, because a development application is a public process. And a public process has hearings, and a hearing has a podium. And at that podium, a man with a recorded deed can stand up in front of the County Planning Commission and the press and every neighbor in Stone Ridge and explain exactly whose land Meridian had drawn its houses on. Through that fall and into the winter, the staircase kept climbing, one dated step at a time. Diane sent a notice that my fence itself was in violation of community standards and would be removed if not brought into compliance, which was rich, considering the fence predated her subdivision by half a century and her own husband had bought the Hutchins land with that fence already standing. That was Incident 9. She sent a notice that my stock water crossing was an unpermitted structure. She sent a notice that the agricultural use of the parcel violated the community's residential character, a parcel that had grown cattle since before her grandparents were born. Each one I photographed, filed, numbered, and answered through Ruth in a single, calm sentence citing the deed. Each one made the folder heavier and made their eventual position worse. In December, a neighbor of mine named Tom Reyes, who ran horses on the parcel west of Stone Ridge, called me up out of the blue to tell me the association had started sending him letters, too, about a strip of his land along the road that they suddenly wanted for drainage and a turn lane, and he wanted to know if I had any idea what in the world was going on. I told him to start a folder. He laughed until he realized I was not joking. And then there was a long pause on the line, and he asked me what I meant exactly by a folder. So I told him, date everything. Photograph every notice the day it comes, save it twice. Get a case number from the sheriff, even when nothing happens. Never call her angry, never sign anything, never move anything. Just write it down. And Tom started a folder that week. The Tom became the second voice in the file, the independent witness who could stand up under oath and say the pattern was not personal, and it was not about me. It was about a company that needed dirt and was willing to invent authority to take it from whoever owned the dirt it needed. The day it crossed the line was a Wednesday in February, and it crossed it hard. Nora called me from the bus stop at the bottom of our road at 3 in the afternoon, and her voice was wrong before she said a word. There were men at our east fence. 3 of them, with a truck and bolt cutters and a spool of new wire, cutting my fence and rolling it back and dropping survey stakes with little pink flags into my pasture. My cattle were drifting through the gap they had made. Nora was 16 and alone at the bottom of the road, and there were 3 men with cutting tools on our land, and she did the exact right thing, which was to not go up there. She stayed at the stop, and she called me, and she kept me on the phone, and I told her to walk to the Reyes place, not the house, the Reyes place, and stay there, and she did. I called Marcus Lau on the other line while I drove. I told him men were cutting my fence and turning my cattle out and dropping stakes on my deeded ground, and I gave him the case number from the fake inspector, the same number he had written down 9 months before, and he said he was already rolling. When I got to the east pasture, there were 3 contractors standing in the gap they had cut, a foreman holding a work order from Meridian Land Partners, and Diane Pruitt sitting in the passenger seat of a white SUV at the edge of the road. I did not yell. I have thought about that drive many times since. The whole long climb of it pressed into 10 minutes of gravel, and the thing I felt by the time I parked was not rage. It was a kind of stillness, because I knew the file had finally caught up to the moment. I had 31 years and 40 pounds of paper, and a deed recorded before her husband was born, and they had just cut my fence in front of a witness on a Wednesday afternoon. Marcus arrived 4 minutes after I did. He took one look at the cut fence, the work order, and the survey stakes, and his whole posture changed. He told the contractors to stop work and step back. The foreman waved the Meridian work order and started to explain that they were authorized by the association to clear an encroachment on common area. And Diane got out of the SUV and walked up in her heels on the soft ground and said, "The line I will not forget as long as I live." She said, "This is association land now, Deputy. It is functionally part of our community, and we are within our rights to take possession of it. Functionally part of our community." She said it to a sheriff's deputy standing over a freshly cut fence, with my cattle walking through the hole. Marcus asked me one question. He asked if I could show ownership. I told him I could, that I had the recorded deed in the safe at the house 10 minutes away, and that it described that exact pasture by meets and bounds with the iron pins still in the ground. He told the contractors nobody was cutting another strand until that deed was on the hood of his truck. And then he did the thing that mattered most. He did not take my word, and he did not take hers. He called the county recorder's office on his own radio and asked them to pull the deed by book and page. The numbers I gave him from memory because I had read them 10,000 times, and the recorder read back the legal description over the radio, while 4 contractors and 1 HOA president stood in my pasture and listened. The description matched the ground we were standing on. It did not match the amended plat. The deed was recorded in 1949. The amended plat had been drawn the previous year. There was a long quiet after that, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. Diane Pruitt stood in the cut gap of my grandfather's fence, in her flare-red blazer and her ruined heels, and for the first time in 11 months, she did not have anything administrative to say. The foreman folded his work order back up and put it in his pocket, like he wished he had never taken it out. Marcus turned to the contractors and told them they had cut a fence and crossed a recorded boundary on a written order, and that the order did not make it legal, and that the county would be looking very closely at who signed it. Then he turned to Diane and asked her plainly who had authorized the work. And she made the second mistake of her day, which was to answer. She said Meridian had the authority, because Meridian held the development rights. On a county road in front of a deputy, she tied the fence cutting directly to her husband's company. I laid the deed on the hood of Marcus's truck 20 minutes later, after I drove home and got it out of the safe in its plastic sleeve and drove back. He looked at it for a long time, the recorded original with the recorder's stamp and the date in the corner, and he ran his finger along the meets and bounds and then looked up at the fence line and back down at the page, matching the words to the ground the way I had taught Nora to do. The iron pin at the corner was 12 feet from where we stood. I walked him to it and brushed the grass off the top of it with my boot. The same pin, the same iron, set off the survey of 1949. Then he looked up the road at the white SUV, which still had not moved, and he said the thing I had waited 11 months and 31 years to hear a uniform say. He said, "Mr. Braid, Calloway, this is your land, and it always was. And now I have a fence that somebody cut to prove they knew the difference and did it anyway." He took the work order into evidence. He took the survey stakes, all of them, pink flags and all. He took Diane's statement and the foreman's and each contractor's separately, so the stories could not be lined up later. And he wrote a report that did not have a single soft edge in it anywhere. The fine clock that Diane had run against me had reached, on paper, a little over $91,000. The amount of that fine ever collected was zero. Not $1, not 1 cent, not ever. That is the pair of numbers I keep. The 91,000 she claimed and the 0 she got. And I think about how cleanly they sit next to each other and how the gap between them is the whole story. What followed was not a courtroom drama, because the courtroom part was almost boring once the facts were on the table. The quiet title suit collapsed. Ruth filed our answer with the deed, and the original survey attached and counterclaimed for the cut fence, the trespass, and the cost of the cattle we spent 2 days gathering off the county road. Meridian's lawyers asked for a continuance, then another, then offered to dismiss their own case if we would walk away from ours. We did not walk away. The case that mattered, though, was not the civil one. It was the one Marcus started. The work order Diane confirmed on a county road tied the destruction of my fence to Meridian Land Partners, and once the county started pulling threads, the development application unraveled with it. The Planning Commission, hearing that, should have rubber-stamped the new phase, turned into something else entirely. I stood at that podium on a Tuesday night in spring, in the county building, with my deed in a folder in my hand, and Tom Ray's in the row behind me, and Nora beside me in her good shirt, and I did not give a speech. I have heard men give speeches at podiums for 30 years and watched commissioners stop listening halfway through. So I gave the commission the book and page of my deed, the date it was recorded, the names of the corner monuments, and the date Meridian's amended plat had been drawn. And then I stopped talking and let those 2 dates sit next to each other, the way I had let the 2 fine numbers sit. The commission did the math out loud into the microphone for the whole room to hear. One member asked the Meridian representative to produce the recorded instrument that gave the company title to my 40 acres. The representative could not, because there was none. The 41-lot phase had been platted across land Meridian did not own, on the strength of a survey that contradicted a deed recorded 70-some years earlier by people who never once walked to the recorder's counter to check. They tabled the application that night. Then, 3 weeks later, after the fence-cutting report and Diane's own recorded statement and Carol DeVoe's account of the board meetings came into the record, they denied it outright on the record, by unanimous vote. Glenn Pruitt lost the phase. 41 lots that had existed only as ink on a plat went back to being my pasture, which is what they had been the whole time, which is what they will be when my daughter's daughter runs cattle on them. Meridian, it came out over the following months, had borrowed against that expansion before it was approved, the way overconfident men do, and when the expansion died, the loans did not, and the company that had tried to take 40 acres of my grass to build its next fortune. Diane Pruitt resigned as president of the Stone Ridge Ranch Homeowners Association before the board could vote on whether to remove her, which they were going to do, because it turned out the homeowners of Stone Ridge did not love discovering that their association dues and their good name had quietly funded a private land grab run, exposing every one of them to liability for the cut fence and the false inspections done under their association's letterhead. A woman named Carol DeVoe, who had sat on that board and voted against the resurvey from the very first meeting, gave a sworn statement laying out the planning sessions where the whole scheme was discussed. Who said what, who knew the parcel was deeded and pushed ahead anyway, and that statement did more damage than anything I could ever have said in anger. There is a coda to the consequence that I will tell you, because it is the one thing in this whole business that I did for myself, and it was legal, and it was quiet, and it was the closest I came to anything you could call satisfaction. When the dust settled, the county's judgment in the counterclaim awarded me the cost of the cut fence, the cattle gather, and my fees, and it also recorded formally the true boundary, the one my grandfather set in 1951. As part of cleaning that up, the survey of record confirmed something nobody at Stone Ridge had ever bothered to check. The little prefabricated building the association used as its board office, the one with the sign and the flagpole, where Diane had run 11 years of meetings, sat at the corner of an access drive that the corrected survey put across a strip of my deeded land, an old easement that had reverted when the original use lapsed. They had been driving to their own front door across my ground for years, and never once checked the deed, which by then did not surprise me at all. So I did the only thing the law allowed and the situation invited. I fenced my line. I built a clean, legal, permitted wire fence along my recorded boundary. Posts deep, corners square, exactly where the deed said it could go, and that line ran across the only vehicle approach to the board office door. They could not drive to it. They could not comfortably hold a meeting in a building they could not reach. The association moved its meetings to a rented room above the hardware store in town, and the little office with the flagpole sat quiet behind my fence. On the line my grandfather walked, and I never said a single word to anyone about it. The fence said it for me. I did not gloat. There was nothing to gloat about. A man cut my grandfather's fence, and my daughter watched it from a bus stop, and no amount of paperwork makes that a good day. The fence is back up now. I rebuilt it myself, the same line, the same corners, the iron pins, exactly where they have been since 1949. And I sank the new posts deeper than the old ones, because I am 63, and I would like this fence to outlast me the way the last one did. There is a gate in that fence on the east line, and through it you can see the rise where the cottonwood stands. Late this summer, on an evening when the light went gold across the pasture, the way it does in August, Nora and I drove the side-by-side up to the top of that rise and sat for a while near her mother's stone. We pulled a few weeds. We watched the cattle graze the bottomland below us, the same 40 acres a woman in a red blazer had once told me to clear. Nora is going to study surveying. She decided it somewhere in the middle of all this, watching me read book and page numbers off a deed to a deputy over the radio, and she told me that evening, with her knees pulled up and the valley laid out below us, that she wanted to learn how to read the ground the way I do, so that nobody could ever stand at her gate and tell her the dirt was not hers. I told her that was the whole job, reading the ground and keeping the paper, that there was no trick to it beyond doing the boring part every single time. I told her that her grandmother would have liked, knowing she chose it. The cattle were back on the east pasture, where they belonged, where they had been since before. Any of these people drew a single line on a single sheet of paper, the folder with the date, and the words East Line on the cover sits closed in my safe, now finished. Ellen's promise was kept. The land was ours, and it stayed ours, the quiet way. Wah! So here is the lesson, plain. Because I told you at the start I would give it to you plain, at the end. If somebody with a clipboard tells you your land is not your land, do not argue with them on your gate. Go to the county recorder and pull your deed. Read the legal description and walk it against the ground, pin to pin, corner to corner, and know where your line actually runs before anyone tells you where they think it runs. Date everything. Photograph every notice and save it twice, because the original always vanishes. When the law comes out, get a case number, even if nothing happens that day, because a pattern is built one dated page at a time, and the day you need it, you will be glad it is there. Do not raise your voice. Raise your paper. The clipboard is loud and the deed is quiet, and the deed wins every single time, as long as you did the boring work of keeping it. If you have a story like this, a fence, a gate, a line somebody tried to move, tell me about it down below, because I read them, and they are why I do this. Subscribe if you want to ride along for the next one. And the next one is a good one. A retired water rights engineer up in the high country A brand new HOA that decided the creek running through his place was a community amenity, and the 100-year-old filing they never thought to check. I will see you there.